So far what we have in our application is client to microservice communication, in which our MVC project is directly communicating with all of the microservices. Direct client to microservice communication seems straightforward, but it is not the most ideal approach. Think about the next enhancement you might want to do to the project. Like, let's say you want to add a mobile application which will use the same microservices. If we use direct client to microservice communication, then let's say the new mobile app we'll build using Xamarin will have to directly call the services as well. The Xamarin app will have to remember the URLs to all of the microservices, and it would also be possible that they want to use different protocols. Also, what if you want to share some code across both the applications, the MVC and the Xamarin, like the authentication code? If we use the direct client to microservice architecture or communication, sharing is easy, but there are other downsides as well. Let's take a look at few disadvantages of client to microservice communication. In this case, we are introducing tight couplings between the client and the services. The client needs to know a lot about the services, and it also needs to make calls directly into the services. If we change something inside our API service, then it can have an impact on the client as well. Versioning can help here, but the coupling is still too tight right now. Then all of our microservices are directly exposed to the outside world, which means we need to put strict measures in place for all the services individually. Then if you make changes on the API calls, the apps that are using this API endpoints will also be impacted. So a versioning strategy will have to be put in place for sure. These are just a few disadvantages of client to microservice communication. The solution to all of them is introducing a gateway. Gateway will be a single point of entry for all the services. What we will bring in is basically a new service that sits in front of our services, providing a single point of entry to the services. It is now basically a controlled access. Only through this service point or entry point can a client application now access our services. Now a gateway can also contain shared functionality. Things like authentication cannot be added on this one service, because of which the authentication and identity server or such APIs will be outside of the gateway. Adding a gateway is extra work, but it is mostly useful if your application is somewhat larger. In fact, you'll see that you'll end up with several gateways, one for each front end. Like one will be for MVC application and then another one for a Xamarin application. In this course, I will give you a brief overview of a gateway called as Ocelot. We will not dive into the advanced handlers and other details with Ocelot, but I will give you a brief introduction to Ocelot. Ocelot is an open source .NET Core based API gateway especially made for the microservices architecture that needs unified point of entry into their system. It is lightweight, fast, scalable, and provides routing and authentication among many other features. That being said, there are disadvantages of adding a gateway as well. I do want to say that advantages often outweigh the disadvantages. So for most of the time in a large-scale project, I often prefer gateway in front of my services. But for completeness, let's see what are the possible disadvantages. First is the one that is an advantage as well, which is tight coupling. Just like we had the possible couplings between clients and microservices, now we also start having tight coupling between gateway and services. But in this case, the tight coupling will be limited to one layer as compared to previous scenario where it was across all of the services. However, adding a gateway means that you are introducing an extra layer that comes with some downside. One of the most common one is speed, and extra effort will also be required to develop and test this layer. So it is definitely something to keep in mind that the gateway is the entry point of the service, and it is in fact also a service, because of which it will require development time. Typically in a large application, it will have its own team that will be managing the gateway. Because of that, it can get pretty extensive. So that being said, from the next video, let me walk you through Ocelot and show you how we can configure that within our application. But I still believe if your application is large scale, then Ocelot or any other gateway is the ideal way because the advantages outweighs the disadvantages.